In our first reading tonight, we heard a remarkably utopian account of the early church. In the second chapter of the Acts of the Apostles, the very same chapter that begins with the day of Pentecost, with the Holy Spirit descending upon the first Christian believers, the Christian community is described as a completely, maybe a tad unrealistically, united one, worshiping, breaking bread together, holding all things in common. They would sell their possessions and goods, the author of Acts tells us, and distribute the proceeds to all, as any had need. 2 chapters later, in chapter 4, verse 32, Acts is even clearer about the mechanics of this arrangement. The whole group of those who believed were of one heart and soul, and no one claimed private ownership of any possessions, but everything they owned was held in common. There was not a needy person among them, for as many as owned lands or houses sold them and brought the proceeds of what was sold. They laid it at the apostles' feet, and it was distributed to each as any had need. If you have even the crudest understanding of political or economic philosophy, you know that this system sounds an awful lot like communism. Karl Marx may have believed that religion was the opiate of the masses, but his way of thinking had many elements in common with at least what is described in the New Testament of the nascent Christian movement. However often Christians have complained about communists over the years, however tempting it may be in this particular neighborhood to defend the system of capitalism, it certainly sounds as if the early church aspired towards what might be fairly labeled as communist. How successful the church actually was in being communist is another matter. Sure, Acts tells us that the believers are sharing things in common, but only in the second chapter, and then again in the fourth. There are many other chapters in the Acts of the Apostles. We don't know for how long the believers were able to sustain their efforts towards sharing everything in common. After that second articulation of the communitarian ideal, it seems as if the efforts already begin to fall apart. And in the fifth chapter of Acts, trouble starts to brew. That fifth chapter, you may know, tells us about a man named Ananias and his wife, Sapphira. This couple sells a piece of property and donates a part of the proceeds of that sale to the community of the church. But in the 3 chapters before, we learned that the believers were supposed to share all of their property in common, not just some of it, as Ananias and Sapphira do. The apostle Peter figures out what is going on. He challenges Ananias and Sapphira and accuses them of cheating and of lying. One after the other, the 2 insufficiently generous Christians fall down and die. For their lying and their withholding of some of their property, they are sentenced to death. Peter doesn't impose their sentence of capital punishment. God does. But it is imposed nonetheless. The implication of the story of Ananias and Sapphira, at least as I see it, is twofold. Number 1, depending on who you are, communism may sound like a great idea. But in practice, it isn't so easy to be a communist. When it comes down to it, even those of us who are most generous don't really want to share absolutely everything we have with everyone else. And number 2, whatever the political or economic system we adhere to, that system needs to have rules, boundaries, and standards. And those rules, those boundaries, those standards have to be enforced. Ananias and Sapphira would have cheated the church according to its own agreed upon standards, and Ananias and Sapphira would have gotten away with all of it had Peter not stood up to them, and had God not backed Peter up. Tonight's reading from the Gospel of John is also about the establishment of proper boundaries. This coming Sunday, the fourth Sunday of Easter, as I mentioned already, is colloquially known as Good Shepherd Sunday. It's the Sunday each year on which we recognize Jesus as our Good Shepherd. But if you were listening carefully, as Kat read that excerpt from John's Gospel, you will have noticed that nowhere in the excerpt we read for tonight does Jesus identify himself as a shepherd. He will do that later in this chapter, in a portion we won't read until next year. But in tonight's portion, Jesus is not the shepherd. Jesus is the gate. Gates, of course, both facilitate and hinder entry. They provide an opening into a wall or fence that otherwise may be completely closed off. But when locked, gates also serve as crucial barriers to intruders. The 10th chapter of John's Gospel specifically mentions thieves and bandits as types of intruders that we should be wary of. The chapter also seems concerned in general about all kinds of strangers. Yet regardless of what types of intruders may be seen as threats, Jesus recognizes that the sheep need more than just care. Care is wonderful, but on its own, care or compassion is not sufficient. The sheep also need protection. In order for them to have life and to have that life abundantly, the sheep must not be at risk of losing their life to any intruder that might want to steal or kill or destroy. As many of you know, I'm one of the leaders of this parish church, a Christian community of faith that genuinely seeks to welcome all. We flail and fail at that from time to time, but we often succeed brilliantly at doing what we say we're going to do. There are times, though, in which our very understandable instinct towards welcome, at flinging the doors wide open to anyone and everyone who wants to come, conflicts with our also very understandable instinct towards security. Occasionally, it is very clear exactly who the thieves and bandits are. And every now and then, unfortunately, we have had to literally stop a thief or a bandit. At other times, someone who is merely different is mistakenly seen as a dangerous threat. Most often, though, when our passion for welcome feels at odds with our commitment to security, the dilemmas we face are legitimately ambiguous, deeply gray. Do we do everything we can to preserve our security and risk keeping someone who belongs here out? Or do we keep the doors open wide at all costs and potentially put our safety in danger? Seeing Jesus as the gate helps us to view security as a sacred duty, but importantly as a sacred duty that need not conflict with welcome. Gates, as I said, both facilitate and hinder entry. When they work well, they open wide to let in everyone who needs shelter and care. And they also keep the threats out. The difficulty in practice is distinguishing between who needs care and thus truly belongs, and the danger that must be kept out. It is easy to make mistakes. And that's why, for me at least, it's helpful that at the end of the day, the gate is ultimately not us. It's not up to us at any fundamental level to determine who is an innocent sheep or a lying bandit, who gets to be in and who has to be out. The gate is Jesus Christ. Our faith is in a person who is also an entryway, who has led us into the peace and serenity of these green pastures, and who is working right now to ensure our safety and our security, even when it feels like the valley of the shadow of death is closing in, even when it may seem like the intruders are near at hand. Jesus is the gateway that leads to abundant life. Our job at the end of the day, as difficult as it may sometimes be, is to trust him and to walk through.